Hate speech laws are in the news again as the Canadian government seems to be intent on basically becoming a North American version of communist China, trying to maximize their authoritarian control on multiple fronts, the medical mandates and lockdown restrictions, of course, being the main thrust of it this past year from 2020 to 2021, but now also with attacks on free speech with new proposed hate speech criminalization, hate speech penalties. So I wanted to bring up a few points about hate speech laws that I haven't heard brought up. What I normally hear in criticism of hate speech laws, which is a good criticism, is that the definition of what counts as offensive speech or hate speech is ever broadened, right? It might start as a limited list of things you can't say or talk about, but then that list grows or is so loosely defined that almost anything can fall under it. Anything that the censors don't want you to say can be just labeled whatever ambiguous term that they've defined as hate speech. So that is a good criticism of hate speech, and there's a really excellent article that I came across recently that gets into the details of exactly how they expand on those definitions or utilize ambiguous definitions, and I'm going to link to that article below. I recommend you read it. But I wanted to add a few other elements of what's wrong with hate speech laws that I don't hear people talking about, but I think are also very important and should be part of the critique of this authoritarianism. So, to start with, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Amos 5:15, which says that we should hate evil and love the good. And this is worth mentioning because it seems to have been forgotten or at least put to the side that the fact that hate is extreme dislike, and it is sane and good to have extreme dislike for certain things, namely evil things, right? You can dislike something, and then if you dislike it to a higher degree, we would say you really dislike it. But if you dislike it even more, to an even higher extent, you could say you really, really dislike it. Or at that point, you could say you hate that thing, right? Maybe this could be about anything, right? It could be about a particular food or drink, whatever. Oh, I love this one, but I hate that one. There's nothing wrong in having an extreme dislike for certain things, whether it's just a mundane thing like a type of music or, type of food, or if it's something more serious like tyranny or abuse, right? It's totally okay to have hatred for those things. So I think it's important off the bat to just make it clear that we shouldn't feel uncomfortable even using the word hate, right? Like some activists are just saying these simple statements like hate-free zone or like no hate allowed, but that's absurd. It's basically promoting amorale. It's saying that you can't have a strong or extreme dislike of anything, which is absurd. It's totally natural and normal and good in many cases, right? Especially when what you're hating is evil. It's good to hate evil. And why is that? Because if you didn't hate it, you would tolerate it and it would flourish, right? So evil makes the world a worse place, right? It makes life more hellish. So it's good that people hate it, because if they didn't, it would just be supported and, like I said, would manifest even more. So that's one point. You might say a minor point, maybe even semantics, but I think it's worth mentioning, right? It's okay to hate certain anything really, like whether it's a particular style of clothing again or whatever. Don't feel uncomfortable using the word. It's okay. All right, this leads me to um, another aspect of what's wrong with hate speech laws, which is that when the punishment doesn't fit the crime, that's actually a form of abuse, right? If someone goes into a store and is careless and starts dancing and whirling around and they break a vase that was for sale in that store, what would be the proper, solution, or what would be justice served in that scenario? I think most people would agree that the person that broke the vase should have to pay for the vase, right? And that, in most cases, would resolve the situation, right? Justice would have been served, and that would be the end of it, and it would be fair. However, let's say the owner of that store said, "Oh, you broke my vase, so I'm going to lock you up in the basement for 5 years," right? I think most sane people would agree that is uh, not a fitting punishment to the crime, right? It's so excessive, in fact, that the person administering this punishment is actually more in the wrong than the person that broke the vase, right? Because it's excessive, right? It's an excessive punishment. So this is something that needs to be talked about, and I haven't heard anyone talking about it, right? They're just talking about problems with the wording of hate speech laws, and again about the ambiguous or ever broadening definitions of what qualifies as hate speech. But little attention has been given to, well, what would be an appropriate punishment if it actually really was abusive speech, right? So there's the problem of things being labeled abusive or hateful or bad that aren't really bad, right? It's just censors trying to quiet certain points of view that they don't like. That certainly is a big part of it. But also, what needs to be considered is, let's say someone really is doing something, is really saying something abusive, right? Just saying something really, really mean, really, really heartless, just unkind to an extreme degree, okay? What is an appropriate punishment for that? So, what I just read this morning about the new proposed hate speech laws in Canada said something like tens of thousands of dollars in fines, and I forget how long possible imprisonment. So the question that needs to be asked is that in any way punishment fitting the crime? This is again assuming that what they actually said is abusive. It may not be, right? It may just, maybe they criticize the government and now the government has classified that as hate speech, right? I mean, this actually has and does go on in communist countries, right? If you criticize the government, you could face imprisonment, right? You're a political prisoner, basically, right? So there is that issue. But I'm saying even if what the person said really was bad, like it wasn't just criticizing the government, which isn't a bad thing. Maybe they, you know, think of like something that's just obviously bad, like someone just says really mean things to an innocent child or something like that, right? Like that shouldn't be allowed to go on, right? Like if you, if someone started yelling abusive things at your own child, right, you would want to stop that person from doing so and, you know, have justice served in some manner, right? But again, there is an appropriate response that's just, and then there are many inappropriate or excessive response. You have to make sure the punishment fits the crime. So like I gave it the example of, you know, breaking a vase in a store and the store owner is saying, well, I'm going to lock you in my dungeon for 5 years or whatever, or this other example I just gave, right? I hope it's 100% clear that excessive punishment is something to be wary of, right? And yet I don't hear this being discussed concerning hate speech laws at all. So that's a major blind spot. If the government says you've committed a hate speech violation, what is an appropriate punishment for that? Tens of thousands of dollars in fines and imprisonment is certainly excessive for speech, right? It doesn't fit the crime, right? And then on top of that, there's the issue of just them being a false authority who shouldn't even, you know, be in this position to make that judgment and carry out whatever punishment they decide in the first place, right? And that's what I was discussing in my previous talk on censorship, which is the issue of claimed superiority by whoever is doing the censoring, right? If they're saying, what you're saying is bad, and so I'm going to punish you for it, and I'm going to decide what that punishment is, that is assuming that the person doing that censoring, that judging, and that punishing is in the right, that they are correct, right? So in order for them to be correct, they would have to be morally and intellectually superior than just your average Joe, right? So it's a claim of superiority by saying, I can make these judgment calls and I can meter out whatever punishment I see fit or whatever I believe is appropriate, right? So they could be making a mistake or deception concerning what actually is abusive speech. And then on top of that, they can be giving a punishment which is excessive. So it's doubly wrong, right? It's doubly abusive and authoritarian, being presented to the public as if it's, you know, for the greater good, right? And of course, the utilitarianism coming back around again. So the key points, again, that need to be part of the discussion or part of the criticism of hate speech laws is that, number one, it's a claim of superiority by whoever's doing the censoring, and that superiority is usually bunk on its face. It's just clearly just coming out of nowhere. It's not legitimate. It's just based on their title, right? They're just saying, oh, well, I have this position, I have this employment, therefore I can meter out these judgments and punishments. Secondly, the issue of excessive punishment being worse than the initial offense needs to be recognized. And like I said from the start, hating bad things or just with your personal preferences in life, hating whatever you don't, whatever you don't like, it's just it's just an expression of extreme dislike. It's not inherently wrong, right? So this is just a false morality used as a Trojan horse for authoritarianism. So I hope these points made sense to you and that you'll share them with others when you're speaking out against this other aspect of the global increase in tyranny and communism, which has been occurring. All right, thank you for listening.